Like many of you, I just saw a video pop up on my feed from one of my personal favorite YouTubers, Thomas Howell. And he was talking about how you should not read books that you do not enjoy. And this video sparked a little bit of discussion here on BookTube about, are there scenarios where DNFing books or not finishing books that you've started is actually a good thing, beneficial for everyone? And there were some different ideas that were thrown out there about this and responses made to Thomas's video. And I thought I would just elaborate on Thomas's points in the video from my own perspective, offer for whatever it is worth, my own 2 cents on the subject. The idea of DNFs, it's really interesting because oftentimes when we're talking about not finishing a book, there's several reasons for that. And I've talked about this on here before. For my money, I think a lot of times how you perceive a book in the moment is directly based upon your expectations for that book going in. So, for example, I recently DNF'd The Daughter's War by Christopher Buehlman. And this was a surprising DNF for me. This was a book that I really expected to enjoy because The Black Tongue Thief, which I read a couple years ago, is one of my favorite fantasy novels. I had such a fun time with Black Tongue Thief that I thought that experience was going to transfer over to Daughter's War. And then I read through half of The Daughter's War, realized the reading experience was nothing like what The Black Tongue Thief was for me. And so I DNF'd it. And I made a video about how The Daughter's War was a study in expectations for me, where I expected one thing going in and I got something completely different. And I don't know if that was due to the marketing of the book or me not realizing what I was getting into when I started it or what. I don't know. But for whatever reason, what I expected going in was not what I got when I was reading the book. And therefore, my experience of that book was far less than I thought it would be. And I think this brings up the conversation of, is there a point where you should quit reading a book? Is there a point where, you're getting diminishing returns on that investment that you're putting in, your time? And I think that's a nuanced conversation because I think of another reading experience I had with The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. This book is, as you can see, it's a behemoth. It's no small book. And the first 100 pages of this book, honestly, I thought about DNFing it, because the first 100 pages of Pillars of the Earth are fairly slow. And I remember at the time, this was now several years ago, I was expecting something to happen, I guess. And again, it comes back to that expectations idea that I was thinking something was going to happen that was not happening, and therefore I was feeling like I wasn't getting what I signed up for. But if you have followed me for any length of time, you will know that I talk about Pillars of the Earth glowingly all the time, almost every chance I can get, because Pillars of the Earth was one of the best reading experiences I have ever had. And if I would have DNF'd it after the first 100 pages where I was not as invested, I would have missed out on the next 800 pages that were, for me, some of the best reading that I've ever done. And so it brings up this question of is there a point where DNFing is a bad thing? Is there a point where DNFing is a good thing? And what is that gray area in between? First off, I think I should just tell you that I don't really know. I don't have a definitive answer of this is when you should DNF, this is when you shouldn't DNF. But I think there is kind of this weird gray area where you as the reader know more than I can tell you whether or not what you're getting out of a book is, what you expect or what you need. I can tell you this, though, and maybe this is a bad way of looking at life, I guess, but I think about life as you've only got a finite amount of time, it's sad, but it's just the truth. At some point, we're all going to die. And obviously, you don't want to think about, your experiences in a finite, the clock's running out, and if you've only got this amount of time left, that's a terrible way of thinking about things. And I understand that, but there is a date, and there's an expiration date on this thing. And if you think about it in terms of there's only a finite number of books I can read before I die, that does kind of add a bit of urgency to it. Like, well, I probably shouldn't read books I hate if I can only read a certain number of them before I'm not here anymore. Let's say, like, the average American reads less than 12 books per year, which is less than 1 book per month. And we're going to assume that you, being the above average reader that you are, read double, more than double what the average American would read in a year. We're going to assume, for the sake of argument, you read 30 books a year, which is not the most that you're going to see on here. Some people read 100 plus books a year. So we're going to assume 30. We're also going to assume that you've got 40 years left in your life, which I know some of us aren't going to make it that long. Some of us are going to make it longer. It's a flawed argument. It's a flawed exercise, but we're just going to go somewhere in the middle and hit a median. That means that if you read 30 books a year for the next 40 years, you have 1,200 books that you can read throughout the rest of your life. That seems like a lot. And that's a very optimistic number. It's like, yeah, I've got 1,200 books. I've got some bad books to burn in that 1,200. And you're probably right. But also, if you are an avid reader, 1,200 books is not all that much. Like, you think about the number of books that you have in your house. And I happen to have quite a few books. I think I have about 1,000 books in my house. And if I look at the books in my house and I say, the books in my house are the sum total of books that I will read in the rest of my life, that is a little sad. It's not as many as you think. 1,000 books? It's a lot of books, but it's also not that many books in the grand scheme of things. And you start to pare it down and you realize, well, I would like to read some Dostoevsky. I would like to read The Count of Monte Cristo. I would like to read, and you keep going down the list and you realize these are books that you almost don't account for as, there's going to be releases in your lifetime as well. There's probably going to be 2 or 3, 5, 6, 7 books a year that you really, really want to read that come out that year. And you start to do the thought exercise of, I've only got so much time. You don't want to read books that you don't enjoy with the finite amount of time that you've got. And it kind of creates this natural depression of like, well, I can't get to all the books I want to get to, and that's kind of sad. So the argument for that would be, don't read books you hate. You've only got so much time to read books that you can read, and so read books you're going to enjoy. And I think that is a very solid argument. I totally understand it. And I think like that sometimes, which is probably not healthy, but it is what it is. I don't have an answer for you other than I think if you're reading fiction, generally speaking, it's a pretty good idea not to read books that you don't like. The other thing here is I think if you DNF things sometimes, and this is just a piggybacking on Pillars of the Earth, like if you DNF books sometimes, you're going to miss out on things, and it comes back to the expectations. I think if you properly set expectations and, do a little bit of mental legwork going into it, there's very few books that are actually going to be DNFs, because I think if you know what you're signing up for, and I think you can know for the most part what you're signing up for. Sometimes there's going to be surprises, I think, but for the most part, I believe you can do legwork beforehand to say, this is going to be a book I will enjoy. This is going to be a book I will not enjoy. My example for this is Malazan, Book of the Fallen. A lot of people bounce off this series because it is tough. It doesn't hold your hand as a reader. It forces you to do some mental legwork of your own to figure out what's going on. And a lot of times people read Gardens of the Moon and they struggle with it and they say, this series is not for me. But I think if you kind of push through that and recognize it's really not as tough as some people say, at the same time, you're going to be rewarded as a reader for the effort you put in. If you get far enough in, which for me was the end of the second book, if you can make it to the end of the second book, I think you're rewarded enough by that point where you can say, yeah, I'm on board with what the author's doing. And like the effort you put in is going to be rewarded. Therefore, it is a worthwhile reading experience. The other final thing I'll leave you with, and this might not apply to most of you watching this, and that's totally fine. I also read a lot of history, and I have a history podcast. If you didn't know, I've got a couple of the episodes here on YouTube. When you're reading history, sometimes you're going to read books that are dry. There's really no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You're reading about subjects that aren't always thrilling. There's not a plot. There's not characters that you can get locked in on. And sometimes you're reading about, agriculture or provisioning a army and logistics and math. And sometimes those things are not always thrilling. For example, this one right here, it is Alexander the Great and the Logistics of the Macedonian Army by Donald Engels. I found this book fascinating. I think it's awesome because it gives you exactly how Alexander the Great provided for his army throughout his entire conquest of the Persian Empire, which is something that we probably shouldn't know as much as we know because like this happened thousands of years ago. It's just fascinating that we have this information, that we can do the legwork to figure out exactly how he did this and that and this and that. But as you might imagine, the logistics of the Macedonian army, that's a dry subject. I mean, you're looking at how many cows were here and how he shipped, horses from here to here and how he acquired water here and, things that are very practical, but at the same time, not overly exciting. It's not necessarily going into the battle of Gaugamela or, the Issus or things like this. Like it's not necessarily the exciting parts of the Alexander the Great story. It's the boring parts, but it's nonetheless important because it kind of informs the whole story, as it were. So books like this, if you're looking at it like, I'm bored, I don't want to keep reading this, I'm not getting anything out of it, I would push back that like books like this, if you know what you're getting into, I would say you'd have a great time with it. But at the same time, it's not exactly a thrilling reading experience, and therefore, by some people's criteria, it's a book you should DNF. I would argue that a book like that is great, and it informs you about some things that you otherwise wouldn't know, and therefore makes you a more well-rounded reader and person and whatever else. Ultimately, what I have to give this wider argument about DNFing books is just a simple, I think if you set your expectations beforehand properly, you won't run into many situations where you're going to DNF a book. And if you do, I think you should have some freedom to not read books that you hate. If you are actively hating a book while you're reading it, you're never going to hear from me, oh, you got to finish it. I understand you want to have like the check mark next to the book that you read, because if you put time into it, you want to get some sort of a, feeling of satisfaction afterward, like I did a thing, check. I think that's also somewhat destructive if you're just reading books you don't like and you put yourself in a rut and then you don't like reading anymore and you've kind of drummed yourself out of the practice altogether. So I don't know. If anything, this is a further thought exercise, and I hope you got something out of it. If you enjoyed this video, I have other videos about books and reading and history, and I've got interviews with historians on here as well. Like, subscribe, do all the things, and I'll see you in the next video.